What's up, Humanities? Welcome back to class. Okay, today we have the Ask Me Anything responses, part two, where I'm going to hit 5 more student questions. I thought we have some really interesting ones today. So 2 of these will be a little bit more long-winded answers, and 3 will be pretty short and concise. So here we go. For the first one I have, Lauren Meyer asked, does art influence society or vice versa? Does society influence art? And I would think by the way she asked this one and phrased it, she's talking about art, which would be like paintings and sculptures and that kind of traditional art, but also like music and movies and all the pop culture stuff. I think for that one, it's kind of a chicken or the egg type thing. Like what came first? I think they both actually influence each other. In a lot of ways, art and the stuff that's coming out of Hollywood movies and the music of any given time or decade reflects the cultural issues that are playing out. And then I think also that like musicians and actors and artists in general can have an impact on the culture and the conversations that are going on. So in my view, I don't think there's one correct, perfect answer. This is kind of a subjective one, but I think it goes back and forth. Art influences our culture and society and vice versa. It kind of is a two-way street there. All right. Question number 2 is Izzy Fry. She asked me one, and man, this one we could do probably a whole unit on and really go down the rabbit hole here. But she asked kind of a long question, but to sum it up, she asked what I knew about like the third eye. I think that's what she's getting to, or the pineal gland. It's also called the mind's eye. The pineal gland is a gland inside the middle of your brain. So I'll come back to that in just a second. She also then goes into asking about, do I know anything about or believe in like other dimensions, alternate realities, all that kind of stuff? Well, I'll say this. I'm very curious about all of those things and have looked into it quite a bit. I'll say I'm far from being an expert on any of it. A lot of the discussions about parallel universes and dimensions, I'm super tuned into. I love sci-fi stuff and love like kind of learning about it. But I think a lot of that at our current stage of technology can't really be proven or disproven. It's almost like a religious thing that you might accept on faith and that we need to study and kind of explore a lot more. So think about like alternate dimensions. We did a unit on space stuff and we got into UFOs and those like tic-tac shaped UFOs that could do things that no, human aircraft up to this point in history would be capable of doing, like going 20,000 feet in the matter of a second or two and changing and stopping on a dime. Now, there's a lot of speculation that, man, maybe those are aliens. Maybe there's little green men in those, and who knows what's going on. It's unknown. And the government now, just recently in the last year, is kind of admitting we've seen these things for a long time, and we really don't know what they are. They aren't trying to cover it up and say they're weather balloons or things like that anymore. But if you think about aliens coming from like a distant galaxy or even another solar system in our galaxy that's hundreds of light years away, that would take a really long time to do, even if you're going the speed of light. So I've heard it said by like astrophysicists and stuff that that's not really practical unless they can find ways, for aliens to get here that would allow faster than light travel, like going through a wormhole or something. But another theory I've heard thrown out there is that maybe that they exist in the same time and space that we do, but it is some other form of life, but they're on a different dimension, and somehow they know how to cross those planes and come into, our dimension or our plane of existence. Kind of some heady stuff there. I won't even pretend that I totally understand it, but interesting question that I'll say I'm open-minded about, and I'm definitely curious and trying to learn more. Now back to Izzy's first question about the pineal gland. So I have looked into that a little bit more, and this is something that go back to ancient times. We didn't understand how the whole human body worked, but bodies had been cut up, whether it's on the battlefield or it's some physician doing it. So even in ancient times, some people, probably your average person wouldn't have been, but some people would be aware that there was a pineal gland in the middle of the brain, and what the heck is that for? And, they don't really know how the whole human body and brain functions. And honestly, even today, we don't have a good, solid understanding of how the brain totally functions. We're researching and learning more about it, but who knows? That's kind of an unexplored frontier that we're still learning a lot about. Now, the pineal gland is it's kind of in by like your lizard brain, and it doesn't really have your higher cognitive functions, but you can apparently access it. And we do think it's something important. They used to think that maybe that was where your spirit was and how it would cross over like after you die. That's like the portal that you get into the afterlife or spirit world. Who knows? Like I said, I'm an agnostic. I don't really think those religious type beliefs can be really proven or disproven. But I'm interested in it. Now, to access the pineal gland, there's basically, and I'm not an expert at it, I wouldn't claim that I've done this at all. So take everything I'm saying here with a grain of salt, and I'm basing what I've said about, or my information here is kind of coming from, I guess, 3 different guys that I've listened to in podcasts and interviews. Hamilton Morris, he did a show called Pharmacopoeia, which basically is an informational show about drug use, where he would go through and explain how heroin affects the body and how, cocaine or methamphetamines do. And he would do episodes on all these different drugs, but from a very scientific standpoint. And he'd also cover psychedelics. Apparently, psychedelics like LSD that got very popular in like the 1960s, kind of the peace and love era and resisting the Vietnam War. That apparently can kind of activate your pineal gland, and some people claim to have profound experiences on psychedelics, which they're kind of in a different category of drugs that are not really addictive, but super potent and can really affect your mind. And we haven't done a ton of research on those, and I guess the natural alternative that kind of functions in the same way is there are substances like mushrooms, certain kinds of mushrooms, and things that are also psychedelics that exist in nature. That going even back to ancient times, there was that was kind of seen as like a spiritual type medicine. It wasn't something that you would do recreationally or just for fun like drug use, but that's where people they'd have to make some big decision in life, or they'd want to contact their ancestors, and under the assistance of like a shaman or your local like holy man, in a lot of different cultures, that's what like psychedelics had been used for. Now, in modern times, kind of in the hippie era, in the early 70s under the Nixon administration, all psychedelics were banned and given very stiff penalties. So that kind of stopped research in the United States. But now, marijuana is becoming legal in a lot of places, like our state of Michigan, and also many states and municipalities are starting to reconsider whether like psychedelics should be banned or not, or whether we could use them for like therapeutic purposes. So I think that the research on those psychedelics and how it would affect your mind and your perception of reality, I think we're doing a lot more research on that, and in the upcoming decade or two, we'll probably know quite a bit more about it. So I guess apparently, there's a clinic down in Florida that I'm aware of, and I think one in Oregon, where they'll do research on people with like extreme PTSD or very high levels of anxiety. Also, people that are like have a terminal illness and they're going to die and they're facing their own mortality. Apparently, like psychedelics, when you're taking them in a clinical type setting with a very trained like professional, can wipe out a lot of those fears and kind of reboot your mind. And they think that the pineal gland might have something to do with that, where it just changes, like it activates that part of the brain, and it changes your perception of reality. Now, I'm giving you information there. It's supposed to be an informational setting. In no way am I saying you should go out and do any psychedelics. In fact, I'd say follow the law. Don't break the law. And in Michigan, those substances are still illegal. However, I definitely think that we're going to learn more about it. I'm glad that they're doing more research on that, because in most societies through most of history, those like psychedelic type medicines, like I said, were not recreationally used, and they were seen as like a gift from the gods, that were the most potent of like substances out there that could really kind of like change your mind and open up new pathways for you. Now, I don't know. That's kind of hokey pokey, like, some weird stuff going on there that I don't totally understand, but I am glad that they're doing more research on it. And I definitely think that attitudes will shift on that. This is a Tuluki prediction over the next decade or two. And I think we'll start to understand the pineal gland, the brain more, and how like potentially psychedelics could be used as a therapeutic type medicine for people that have some debilitating, like, mental stressors going on in their life. Okay, hopefully that kind of answers your question, but actually I probably maybe gave you more that response raised more questions than actually gave answers, because like I said, I don't know a ton about that, but I'm super curious about it, open-minded, and I want to learn more. All right. question number 3 from Xander Manzer. This one should be pretty short and sweet. He asked me how I would tweak driver's ed. If you don't know, I am one of the local driver's ed instructors. I've been doing that for about 12 years or so, and I did take a little break in there, and then of course went through driver's ed myself back in the 90s. It used to be driver's ed was funded by the state. So basically, every student going through high school in a public school in the state of Michigan would get driver's ed for free. Now, after, I don't know, the early 2000s, that got switched and the state stopped reimbursing for it. So now you have to pay as a family, out of pocket, to go get that experience. Now, I've long said that, you know what, if somebody is daydreaming in my U.S. history class and they don't learn about all the facts I tell them about Teddy Roosevelt or World War II, well, you're not going to be as well-rounded an individual, but probably nobody's going to die as a result of that. But if you go out and get behind the wheel of a car and you don't know how to use it, somebody could potentially die. That, it could have some dire consequences. So I strongly feel like driver's ed should be funded by the state, and that every student in the state of Michigan should get that training as part of their education. So I would like to go back more to the old way. Also, when I took it, it was a little more simplified. You basically had driver's ed, you drove for at least 6 months on your learner's permit, with your parents or guardian, and then you could go take your road test and get your full license. I thought that was simpler, and now you have the tiers, segment 1, segment 2, then you get your road test, then it's a level 1 license, level 2 license. It's gotten very complicated. I kind of understand it, but man, I can see when I explain it to students or parents, a lot of times their eyes glaze over and they're like, what are all these different steps and processes to get your license? So I would like to see the system get a little more simplified, and I'd like to see it so that everybody gets it for free, because I think driving is an important part of life still until we have fully automated cars out on the roads, which we're not really that close to that yet. And I think all students, whether they come from a wealthy family that can afford it or middle class one, or they're living below the poverty line, because those kids a lot of times can't get, they don't have the money to go take driver's ed. And I think really everybody should have access to that training. So that's how I would tweak driver's ed, kind of go back to the older style. Question number 4, this is a good one. And this is going to be one that is a little bit more long-winded. Taryn Leffler asked me, what do I know about the conflict that's playing out between Israel and Palestine, which has been blowing up in the news recently? Well, I'll say this, and this is a biased take on it, because I would say I'm a little bit more sympathetic to the Israeli cause. So I'll say in the media right now, you see a lot more sympathy towards Palestine and Hamas. I'm not telling you what to believe one way or the other. So you should go dig into this and learn about it on your own and come up with your own ideas. But this is kind of my take of the situation. And I'll admit, I'm not super well versed in this. I kind of have a cursory, just base level knowledge of what's played out there. The Jews have probably been persecuted more than any other single ethnic or religious group in history. Now that's debatable. You might be able to find other groups that would rival them, but for sure, the Jews have been persecuted and targeted kind of anywhere they've lived around the world, from America to Europe to even in the Middle East. Now, after World War II, the most well-known example of Jewish persecution would, of course, be the Holocaust in World War II. What is the Middle East today was primarily controlled in World War II by the British and French, their empires. After World War II, the empire starts to crumble apart, and it was seen as, hey, at the Holocaust, the world had became aware of that, and we were like, man, we should have a homeland for the Jews. They should have their own country, which really hadn't existed for thousands of years, since Rome had conquered Judea 2,000 years ago, back before the time of Jesus. So the British decided to carve out a little chunk of the Middle East, where Jerusalem is, and kind of what was Judea, and that would be the Jewish homeland, and any Jews after the Holocaust could move there, and they would now have their own country, and they wouldn't have to be persecuted or a small minority in any other countries around the world. Millions of Jews did move to Israel. Now, the group that had been living there, it was primarily a Palestinian kind of Arabic Muslim population that had lived there. They're like, hey, they kind of have a valid point here that, like, we weren't the ones that did the Holocaust. Why are you giving our land up and turning it over to these Jews that are coming over here from Europe? So I get that animosity and that kind of backstory. I think creating Israel was done with the best of intentions. And I think there was also a lot of unintended consequences of the way the maps got drawn out there. Now, Jews and Muslims, the Jewish world and the Arabic Muslim world, have been at odds for really thousands of years, where they've had tensions there. So this latest flare up is just the last saga or chapter in an ongoing story that's been happening for literally like thousands of years. Now, in the most recent conflict, I guess this is what had kind of happened and what got it going. There was a chunk of land that the Israelis had won during the 1967 war. That primarily Palestinian people lived there, but now it was occupied and controlled by like the Israeli army. Apparently, there was a court deal that had happened. This is like 50 years ago. That in this apartment complex, Palestinian families were allowed to live there, but they had to pay rent to like the Jewish landlords. Well, from what I know of the story, there was like 4 families that like went through this recent like court case where they had not paid rent in like 50 years, and now somebody new in that Jewish family that owned that building was saying, "We want to start collecting our rent. It's time you start paying." And they didn't pay, so they were going through the court process of evicting them. When that happened, that was kind of the justification. Now, I think I use that term kind of lightly because I think Hamas, which is a basically a terrorist group. The United States State Department calls Hamas a terrorist group. So that's not just me saying it. That's the United States government and Department of State. That was a justification for them to start firing rockets at Israel. They just kind of indiscriminately fire rockets over at populated areas, trying to kill and harm whoever they can, that's a Israeli Jew. They get their weapons. Now, Hamas, this one part of Palestine that's controlled by this terrorist group, they get their weapons from Iran, another kind of state, a terrorist sponsoring state in the Middle East. And in the Middle East, the dynamic is the 2 biggest powers are Israel on one side and Iran on the other. So Hamas is close allies with Iran. They're funneling them weapons. They start firing them at Israel. The Iranians like that because they hate the Israeli Jews and want to wipe them out and wipe that country off the face of the earth. Israel now retaliated back. Now, Israel has far better technology than Hamas. They have a military very similar to the United States military, just on a smaller scale. They also have a missile defense system called the Iron Dome. So as these rockets are coming over from Hamas, like over 90% of them are taken out before they hit any target. But they don't get all of them, and some rockets do hit and end up killing Israeli people. Israel strikes back, and they have better weapons, better rockets, and they go in and try to do very pinpoint strategic strikes where they'll take out the leadership of Hamas. Now, Hamas knows the Israelis have that better technology. So they've actually, this is kind of a common practice for them, I guess. They will build their like headquarters and stuff underground and through tunnel systems, and they'll do it like right underneath a Palestinian school or a hospital. And they'll use their own people as human shields because they know Israel, whenever possible, tries very much not to take out civilian casualties. Now, do accidents ever happen when they're going after some leader of Hamas? Do any Palestinian kids or women and children ever die? Yeah, I mean, it's a war situation. Bad things do happen in war. But I will say, this is what the number one thing that kind of makes me a little bit more biased in favor of Israel. For one, we have a lot more in common, I think, culturally with Israel than we do with Palestine. Maybe that's religious grounds, but that's a Jewish country. America is freedom of religion, predominantly Christian, but we do have Jewish and Muslim populations here. But I'm not even talking about religion so much. Israel is, like, I believe, the only other country on planet Earth that has a constitutional right to freedom of speech. They are a democracy, and they actually have valid elections, a full political process. Now, they have a parliament, not a Congress like we do, but we share a lot in common kind of politically and culturally with Israel. So we have more common ground there. Also, I think whenever possible, stronger country like Israel or America should always try to minimize civilian casualties. So I respect that about them. They're going to throw punches back and try to take out and hurt Hamas, but they do it as much as possible and try not to hurt innocent bystanders. So that gives me a little more respect for the Israeli side. Now, you'll also hear, now here's kind of the counter to it, to my line of thinking, that Israel, it's a lopsided battle and Israel has way better weapons. And it's like, if there's two kids out on the playground that get in a fight and one's some big beefy sixth grader and the other one's a tiny little squirt of a third grader, and the third grader goes and picks the fight, well, is it okay for that bigger sixth grader to just wail on the little kid and knock his clock off? You should have more restraint if you're the bigger, more stronger country with the better technology. But I think it's also a valid point to counter that, hey, when a war happens, it's not about trying to equalize the amount of casualties and pain and suffering. The goal is, if you get attacked and you get drawn into a war, you want to win the war as swiftly as possible, and you want to take out the other side's leadership. And so I don't know. I guess I kind of break with Israel, but I know a lot of people in America now are more sympathetic to the Palestinian side of things. I won't tell you how to believe one way or the other. That's just kind of my subjective take on it, and I will say I openly have bias because I followed that situation for pretty much my whole lifetime, just kind of followed what was going on over there. My prediction for the future, things will probably stay about the same. I expect those tensions to stay high and for that to be an area, kind of a hot zone where there's going to be unrest for the foreseeable future. Hopefully someday they're able to get some sort of a peace agreement and things will chill out, but doesn't look like that's happening in the near future. Last question, number 5 today, was Maddie Price. She asked me, do I believe in ghosts and the supernatural? And if so, have I ever had any experiences? Do I have any ghost stories? For this one, probably not as exciting an answer as you may have hoped for. I'm like how in terms of religion, I'm an agnostic. I don't really believe that the existence of God can be proven or disproven. I sit on the fence and I try to stay open-minded about it. And I definitely would switch to one side or the other if I saw overwhelming evidence, but I don't even see how you could really prove that one way or the other. I'm kind of the same way with ghosts. I hope there's ghosts in like a spirit world. I think it's super cool to think about, and I'm really interested in it. But I've never seen any overwhelming, like, just solid evidence that there is ghosts or a spirit world, other than people's like own personal experiences and like anecdotal stories. Now, I have a lot of friends that believe in ghosts and that claim to have ghost stories. Most of the time, I think I would chalk it up to, it's your mind playing tricks on you. You were out in the dark, something crazy happened to you, you're going through a weird time in your life, and man, something unexplained happens, and you chalk it up to it being a ghost or a spirit. Now, there could be spirits. Like I said, I kind of hope there is in an afterlife. I would hope for that, but I just don't think you can really solidly prove it or disprove it. And as far as my own personal experiences, man, I got nothing. I've had no experiences in my life that I can recollect at this point where I would say, man, I think this might have been a spiritual like encounter or a ghost encounter. So that's kind of where I'll leave it today. Thanks for the questions. I'll probably have 1 or 2 more of these coming out, and don't forget, get journals wrapped up. Check in for our last Q&A, and get any late work that you might have submitted, because we are in the home stretch and about to wrap things up.